These are the notes for 1.3, information about the scientific method. Okay, let's talk about the process of science. Using the scientific method. Scientific method, you've heard about this for years, or you should have, but it's a series of steps followed to solve problems. These steps are not set in stone, like you will jump around the steps, especially in the beginning when you're forming your questions, making observations and predictions. But one of the earlier steps in the scientific method is to state your problem or ask a question. The question must be something that you can find the answer to using an experiment. Now, like I said, the question may come first or it may come after you've done some observations. And we should know what an observation is by now because we have completed our vocabulary in our vocabulary photo album. If we have not, then we need to do that because that is due soon. Now, in this stage of the scientific process or scientific method, there's a lot that goes into the observation step, and we're going to go through each of those now. Okay, so at the beginning of this step, you're just going to make some basic observations. So you're going to make qualitative observations. Remember we said qualitative means you're describing what it looks like, what it feels like, what you see or feel or hear or smell. And then you're going to also make some quantitative observations, meaning anything dealing with the numbers. So you're going to count it, you're going to measure it, things like that. Note the example. And you do this naturally every time you make an observation. You make an inference or using your observation to kind of speculate what has happened. Your inference is an educated guess based on your prior knowledge or experiences. So don't get that confused when you hear or see educated guess. When we're talking about educated guesses, we're not talking about testing them. We're talking about making inferences because you are guessing about what happened or why something is the way that it is using what you already know.
Observation plus prior experience equals inference.
Thank you, Ms. Cook. Note here that what you have learned in English, you are now applying to science. And if you haven't learned it in English yet, you will. You've already learned it in science. Now, before you start doing anything related to trying to experiment on something, you have got to do some research. Quality research will help you develop an excellent hypothesis, which will allow you to test your question. So, in the past, we've always said the hypothesis is an educated guess. It's an educated guess about an outcome that you are going to test. So it's not just an educated guess. An educated guess, remember, is an inference. An educated guess or a prediction about the experiment that you're about to perform to answer your question that you developed is a hypothesis. It's a prediction. Remember the word prediction for hypothesis. Now that you have your hypothesis, you're ready to design your experiment. And when you're designing your experiment, you have to come up with your variables. Your independent variable is the variable that you're testing, what you're manipulating, the factor you're manipulating to determine the effect on whatever outcome you want to see. So, for example, if we were wanting to test whether sugar water increases plant growth, our independent variable would be the sugar water, and our dependent variable would be the plant's growth. So your independent variable, if you want to think about it like in English class, you have a cause and effect. Whatever you've manipulated will affect whatever outcome you have. So we can also think about it as in terms of manipulated and measured. If I'm manipulating something or I'm changing something or I'm adding something, it is the independent variable and it is going to affect whatever I'm measuring. now that you're ready for your experiment, you have got to have a set of procedures. These are the rules that everybody needs to follow who is going to conduct your experiment. So your rules have to be very, very clear, and they have to be very, very exact. So you can't leave anything out when you're designing an experiment. You also need to make sure that you tell the experimenter what materials they need. And whatever you're testing, again, we talked about our dependent variable, it has to be able to be measured. So it could be something like height, weight, volume, density, something you can measure. And your experiment also must have a control group. Your control group is the group that does not get the treatment or does not get the independent variable. And with both your experimental group and your control group, there are other factors that could have been changed that must remain constant, meaning you cannot change them. So with our example with the sugar water and the plant, the only thing that would be different between the two groups is the type of water we're using to water the plant. The plant has to be the same, the soil has to be the same, where it is in the room has to be the same, the temperature that it's exposed to has to be the same. All things that could change or that you could test, you have got to keep constant. Otherwise, you won't know what is affecting your outcome. Now, as you're conducting your experiment, and many of you who were doing the green bean lab know this already, you must collect data. Now, this means all the results that you get while you're performing the experiment. So you will have qualitative data. Remember, this is the descriptions, the color, what it smells like, what it feels like, what you hear. Those are qualitative data that you need to record. And then you have quantitative data, which is the numbers, anything that can be measured. That's quantitative data. And when you're collecting your data, make sure you keep it in a chart. Otherwise, it looks a mess, and you won't be able to read it, and neither will I, and I won't. Now, after the experimentation, you collected your data, you finished your procedures, you have to analyze your data. A lot goes into analyzing your data. This may include creating graphs from your tables, talking about trends in the data, talking about the shapes of the graphs. A lot goes into the analysis of your data, but you must analyze your data in order to come up with conclusions. And we all should have done the graphing activity, and so we should know a lot about this already when we convert our data from tables and make graphs out of them. And remember, your independent variable is always on your x-axis, and your dependent variable is always on the y. And the type of data you have determines what graph you're going to use. And finally, just like when you write in a paper, you must come up with a conclusion. Now, your conclusion is going to make a statement about your hypothesis, whether or not it was proven incorrect or correct by your data. Also, in your conclusion, you are to make recommendations or predictions for improving the test or other things that you think could have changed the outcome of your dependent variable. You also talk about any errors that could have resulted in any kind of mishaps in your data. And if you remember, we said that science is universal, so you must be able to communicate your results to others. And in this class, we do that in the form of lab reports.